Hello, and thank you for joining us for this episode of AMA's Marketing In. I'm your host, AMA CEO, Bennie F Johnson. In our episodes, we explore life through a marketing lens, delving into conversations with individuals that flourish at the intersection of marketing and the unexpected. We hope to introduce you to various visionaries whose stories you might not yet have heard of, but are exactly the ones you need to know. Through thought-provoking conversations, we'll unravel the challenges, triumphs, and pivotal moments that have been shaped by marketing. Today, our very special guest is Tiffany Wilburn. Fearless and brilliant. With over 2 decades of global marketing leadership, Tiffany is known for her fearless creativity and her strategic brilliance. She's held senior roles as Chief Marketing Officer, Interim Chief Marketing Officer, SVP in marketing, consistently transforming brands and driving business success. Tiffany's recent triumphs include spearheading innovation for a major global brand company, Nestle, to reinvigorating other large global brands, to crafting the brand equity strategies for the iconic TGI Fridays. She constantly blends art and science to make marketing with deep understanding of society, culture, and human behavior. Recently, she just expanded her role as the new Global Marketing Strategy Practice Lead. I'd like to welcome Tiffany to our podcast today. Tiffany, welcome.
Thank you, Bennie. I'm excited to be here.
So, I love it when the first time you meet someone, it's not through their image or through their voice, but just through their words. So I'm going to give a quote that's the first one that met me. I'm not afraid to get creative, which means innovation is always on the menu. Talk a bit about this. When did you realize that you were fearless?
When I was a little girl, and my mother brought it to my attention that all the other kids were being so managed and measured with their steps that they took. They didn't go to the top of the hill with their bicycle and come flying down the hill, feeling it with excitement. They were more cautious. They stayed on solid ground. And Tiffany, you're fearless. You just go right to the top and throw yourself off every single time.
Wow. So it's great that we have those attributes that start off in our early memories. Now, when did you transition that or realize you had transitioned that into your professional arc? When did the professional fearless Tiffany emerge?
I'd say it was early in my career. So before I began my career in the food and beverage industry, all in the function of marketing, I actually started in journalism.
Okay.
And I was very shy. I didn't want to be in front of the camera. I didn't want to be behind the mic, but I forced myself to, because I thought there was something different about the perspective I was offering. I thought there was something creative about the approach I took in terms of the storytelling for news articles that I was writing or documentaries I was putting together from a video perspective. So my approach, even when I was a child, was to lean into fear or lean into what feels uncomfortable, and in order to feel comfortable and feel more at peace.
So kind of this leaning into the uncomfortable space in there. We talk about that in marketing as our world has changed so much. When we look at this notion of not being afraid, often fear comes as a part of change in our space. And marketing today and tomorrow is really at the forefront of change. What advice do you have for our listeners, for those marketers at various stages of their career, about leaning in and working through their fear to come on the other side to be fearless in their marketing?
Yeah. I mean, my advice would be, don't think that you're in it alone. Everybody is afraid. Everybody is feeling overwhelmed. Everyone is naturally resistant to change. It's a visceral response that we all have in order to protect ourselves. And so it's not a bad thing. It's what keeps us alive. It keeps us from jumping in front of a bus, or it keeps us from doing things that would actually cause harm to us. But I think it also prevents us at times from experiencing the full range of emotions that are at our disposal. We're only tapping into and leaning into some of the emotions that feel more comfortable. And I have found that there's breakthrough opportunities when you're willing to
Right.
allow yourself to even just step across the line 1 inch, maybe 2 inches, 3 inches, to see how your reception would be different.
It's interesting as you start talking about reaching across and expanding in there. One of the things that's really notable about your career arc is how you've been able to transition into these senior executive marketing roles. And you're working a lot across the table, across the line, across the businesses. What's been a guiding principle or approach for you as your career has grown? Like I said, you're not just doing core marketing, you're actually extending marketing's executive reach.
Yeah. My guiding principle would be very much aligned with that opening quote that you shared, which is don't be afraid.
Right.
And it could be don't be afraid to try, don't be afraid to get creative, don't be afraid to look silly,
All
don't
right.
be
Yeah.
afraid to say I need help. But don't be afraid as a framework is a guiding principle that I have leaned into throughout my career, because fear is
Right.
often behind a lot of the decisions to not move forward.
Right.
And so that's been something that I've been very conscious about and want to proactively address. And so don't be afraid is really been the
Right.
approach that I've leveraged the most.
So how have you, as you've entered into these larger roles of marketing and leadership, how have you been able to champion marketing as a function or as a strategic element in these larger conversations at the executive table?
I have always taken the approach to keeping the consumer in the passenger seat, if you will,
Okay. Right.
not the back seat. I am a social psychologist by trade. So my peers often go to get their MBAs. I actually went and received my master's of science in applied sociology and market research. So people are my widget. Understanding how people engage with each other, how they create shared value, how they create shared language in order to understand as a brand, how can you create a shared relationship with consumers? So for me, championing marketing, regardless of if it's in the food and beverage industry or outside of that industry, it's been very much aligned with people, been aligned
Right.
with the consumers, first and foremost, deeply understanding consumers and ensuring that they have not just a seat in the car, the business
Right.
objectives,
Right.
but
Right.
they're the passenger in the car and they have a role in helping us determine the destination that we're on our way to on the road, but they also can enjoy the journey along the way with us.
So I want to talk a bit about, you spent a lot of time in the food and beverage space. And it's funny, your first quote talked about what's always on the menu. So I'm going to have
Mm-hmm.
a little fun with you since you're being silly in the space in there.
Uh-huh.
What was your favorite menu item to market at TGI Fridays? What
Ooh,
what held a special spot for you?
you know, iconic response would be the mozzarella sticks
Right,
or the whiskey glaze that would go on a chicken
right.
tender or a wing. But honestly, the item that holds my heart um, captive were our truffle tachos.
Okay,
And
tell
it's
me more.
because, yeah, it's because it was so unexpected and there was a
Right.
lot of resistance, AKA fear,
Mm-hmm.
to introducing
Mm-hmm.
that menu item
Right,
nationally because it was different than what our core consumer was typically expecting from the brand.
right,
You wouldn't typically think truffle and TGI Friday. The form of the tacho was a mashup almost between like a potato and a nacho.
right,
So it was a very novel concept to try to communicate. However, the product execution was flawless. Like it
right,
is a phenomenal product, and consumers demonstrated their love for this product in their repeat purchase. They
right.
continued to come back and purchase this product over and over and over again. So for me, the truffle tachos would be my answer.
Nice. I think you may be the first guest I've ever said who's mashed up truffle nachos and tacos. And
Yeah.
I think you may be the, but that speaks of culinary tension. But I want to talk a little bit about the business tension that you started to allude to. So you had corporate business aims of TGI Fridays, but then you had kind of field operational spaces. Talk a bit about how you're able to navigate. Marketing really fits at the nexus of that, right? In terms of
Yeah.
business strategy, both at a national macro level and then at the store field level.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about how you manage that tension.
It's not either art or science, it's both.
Right.
And so the science comes in a lot when we're talking about the operational execution, how our service levels are looking in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the employees taking care of our guests, or how fast the food is coming out hot, how quick the turnover between the consumer order time and the product to
Mm-hmm.
table is. That's all data driven information that we can continuously improve on. But then there's the art, which tends to be the art of selling,
Right.
giving the consumer something to get excited about, whether it's talking about our daily specials or how we're welcoming them when they're coming in through the front door. That all is a part of marketing that is
Right.
very relational in
Mm-hmm.
nature, and it is very distinctive, especially in the hospitality sector, where
Right.
you are a retailer of sorts, but you're also selling your staff, your personnel, and the ultimate product that the consumer is purchasing.
So we look at, like you said, that connection to the consumer. What keeps you connected as you continue to expand? I mean, one of the tensions that we have sometimes is as we move further up in our corporate spaces, the consumer gets further and further out of reach, but
Right.
whether it's further out of embrace. You talked about your experience in market research and understanding human behavior. What keeps you connected?
I love market research, and I that's one of the aspects of the marketing function that I've never handed over to someone on my team, because I need to understand
Mm-hmm.
from the consumer's perspective how they see our product or our brand, how they're utilizing our product or our brand.
Right.
And I also very much love ethnographic research. So shop along. So I may go and do a
Right.
store visit, and in some instances I'm not engaging with the consumer at all, but I'm observing how
Right.
they're interacting with, if it's a bartender in a restaurant example, or if it's a retailer, how long are they spending at the shelf? Are they
Right.
going down the aisle, or are they just using the aisle signage to guide them through the store? I think those are very invaluable data points
Right.
that
Right.
every strategic marketer needs to have awareness of, because there's conscious reaction. The consumer will tell you,
Right.
"Oh, I every morning I make a cup of coffee." But then there's unconscious things that we do. "Oh yeah, I
Right.
forgot every morning when I make a coffee, I also put this little adaptogen in my coffee that helps me
Right.
concentrate." So coffee
Right.
doesn't their response to us may be, "Coffee doesn't bother me at all. I'm not impacted negatively or adversely with caffeine at all." Well, you forgot to tell me you're putting adaptogens in
Right.
there.
Right.
So that's why I love those observational opportunities
I
to
think
stay
that's
connected.
I think that's incredible insight, right? Because there's so much we learn by being present and
Mhm.
observing and kind of walking and living in the space of our consumers and our customers. And I strongly encourage everyone on my teams and we work with to take yourself out of your comfort zone,
Yeah.
whether it's your seat at the table or your seat in the Zoom,
Yeah.
and experience the world through your customers' experience. So you had a chance, you ran innovation, big
Mhm.
idea at
Mhm.
Nestle, big
Mhm.
company, right? Just saying it out loud puts a lot of pressure in that space in there. Talk
Yeah.
about your experience thinking about innovation for Nestle at that
Yeah.
scale and impact.
Absolutely. Well, it was me and many other people, because of
Right.
the size of the
Right.
organization, who were a part of a global transformation initiative for Nestle. I think the bigger opportunity at hand was to find ways to create fewer, more impactful global
Mm-hmm.
innovation projects that
Mm-hmm.
drove top line and bottom line value for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, what was really interesting and influential was having the opportunity to work across Nestle Waters, Nestle
Right.
Purina, as well as the food side of the business. I had, up until that point, only worked in the food sector, mostly
Right.
frozen food. And so that really gave me a opportunity to see how other Nestle opcos thought through product
Right.
innovation, and specifically thought through idea
Right.
to launch, which is, it seems so quick, but it's not. It
It's
can be
not.
a multi-year process to get from a concept to actually having a viable product on shelf for sale at
Right.
retail.
So you've taken this really kind of great growth pattern in marketing roles that are direct to consumer and food and beverage industry and moved up through kind of the marketing leadership ranks. Today, and over the last few years, you've spent a lot of time in what's a new function, which is this notion of a fractional CMO. And that's been a popular term to come up lately, in which people identify they need our marketing research. I need our marketing
Yeah.
insights. They need our marketing leadership. But talk a bit about the excitement that comes with being a fractional CEO and a little bit of a cautionary tale as well of
Yeah.
serving in this capacity.
Well, I love being a fractional CMO and operating as such. And what that means, essentially, I like to use analogies or metaphors. And the metaphor I often use with marketing is a suitcase. The CMO owns the entire suitcase, but inside the suitcase, when you open it up, you've got SEO, you have
Mm-hmm.
website, you have
Right.
consumer insights, analytics, creative, merchandising, product development, on and on and on and on.
Right.
What I love about being a CMO is I have visibility to all of those sub disciplines of marketing. I have
Right.
access to all of those subject matter experts, and I
Mm-hmm.
can strategically pull on all of those levers when needed in order to move the business forward. What a
Mm-hmm.
fractional CMO does is nothing different. They do that work for businesses 1 to 3 days a week instead of
Right.
full time. And that affords them the opportunity of working typically between 1 to 3 different brands or different clients a week. So, what is exciting about it for me is it allows me to engage in the sectors of food and beverage that I am most passionate about. So, I work with distilleries and have in the past, do it presently. That
Mm-hmm.
also affords me the opportunity to continue to work in the hospitality and restaurant
Right.
sector, and then apply that knowledge to categories that might be outside the food and beverage
Right.
industry. Thinking of some recent work I did with a laundry brand. But that's what's exciting about being a fractional CMO. It's applying what I've learned and put
Right.
in practice over the last 20 plus years to businesses who may have an asset light model. Maybe they
Right.
only have
Right.
5 full-time headcount and everybody else is a freelancer or consultant, and it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
a hub and spoke model. Or it's a little bit of a democratization of executive leadership knowledge, and
Right.
companies that typically would never be able to access the executive leadership that you would get from an ex-P&G, an
Right.
ex-Nestle, an ex-Conagra, an
Right.
ex-Kellogg. It gives them the opportunity to have more of a equal playing field with some of those bigger brands. How it can maybe be a little bit of a struggle or a little bit of a downside, I don't think it's for everybody.
Right.
Certainly. You have to have a high level of agility,
Mm-hmm.
and higher than any, typical CMO role that I could ever think of or equate it to. You have to be very agile. You have to know your
Mm-hmm.
voice and know enough about how to support developing others, that it's not just about coming in and telling someone what to do. It's about
Right.
coaching and guiding and potentially shepherding
Right.
internal marketing personnel that they have, but maybe they're not at the level in terms of seniority as you. So that would potentially be the downside. It requires a high level of agility
Right.
and a high level of self-awareness.
Right. Really great advice. What do you see, or what have you seen as the inflection point for organizations to say, I need to bring in a Tiffany. I need to bring
Yeah.
in this fractional CEO. What triggers the business to make this leap?
My experience has been, it's potentially they're looking to sell and they
Mm-hmm.
want to have a fresh perspective on, okay, everything that we've done, the strategies we have put in place, the tactics that we have executed have got us to this point. But in order to sell, we need to increase our top line sales 40% in the next 18 months. We need disruptive thinking. We need someone to come in and really help us blow the doors off. That is one example. Another would be business has been stagnant to declining for a couple years, maybe 3 to 5 years. And they have really strong internal folks, but maybe they're drinking their own Kool-Aid. They just haven't, they can't see outside of the car. The glass is fogged. They don't understand, well, what's wrong? How can we change? We need to have someone come in and support us on that front. And then the other inflection point would be in my experience, there's a new and imminent threat to their market. So maybe it's a new competitor has come in. Maybe there's a competitor who is specifically attacking them on maybe their growth channel. So they were, the business was really successful in retail, and now they have lost 60% of their retail space to this new competitor, and that is significantly putting their total business at risk. So those are the most common reasons that I have been brought into organizations. Now, that's not to say that those are the only reasons. Sometimes it's simply, in my experience, it's been because I've established a really strong relationship with the leadership team, and they appreciate the holistic approach that I take when creating marketing strategies or thinking through product innovation or merchandising challenges that can be overcome. So sometimes it's simply relational.
Right. So we asked the question of when did you realize you were fearless? So the second part of that question is, when did you realize you were a chief marketing executive? When did you kind of fully walk into that space with the confidence of knowing Tiffany is the chief marketing officer?
I don't really like labels, so I just show up, and I believe I have the right to be in every room I walk in.
I love it.
Because
I'm going to ask you to say that again, because people need to hear that over again. Just say it loud for me.
I don't believe in labels. I choose to believe that I deserve to be in every room I walk in. And so I've had the mentality for a long time. I'm not offended if you call me the janitor, but you're going to listen to what I'm going to offer, and let's see how it lands. Just give me an opportunity to share what I know, and let's see what we might do differently. And that has always worked for me. I think, I don't have a conflated sense of self. I'm not attempting to wear my label on my sleeve. I show up, I'm a team player, and I am not above making the coffee just as much as I'm not above creating the strategy for how we grow the coffee brand.
Nice. Speaking of brands, what are some of the brands that excite you today when you look out into the market space? I mean, I'm going to say it so you don't have to. You're an expert in brand disruption and marketing disruption. What are some of the brands that kind of make you smile when you look and go, wow, that's some interesting work they're doing?
Yeah. Outside of the food and beverage industry, the one brand that has been catching my attention is Rivian. And they're primarily in the automotive sector.
I smile because for our listeners, I just sat down with Forrest Young, who just recently left, who was their chief brand officer for Rivian. So that's why we're smiling, because yes, as well.
Well, I like what I see them doing, and I think that they're doing it, I'm going to call it a quiet strength manner. They're not loud, they're not flashy, but they're demonstrating consistency and approachability. And when you're talking about an electric truck that breeds question and potentially fear, and I think they're doing a really good job of meeting the consumer where they're at and humanizing the product without talking about the product so much. So I like what I see them doing.
We're going to have a marketing and first. So I'm going to connect you with Forrest so that I can have two of my guests who are bonding over the brand. So yes.
I love it.
Excellent. And I like to ask that question occasionally because it's interesting to see what my disruptive experts, what they're noticing and seeing in the space. Now, you've recently just added to your plate your role expanded. Tell us about, I know you're shaking your head. We got more work for you to do. So tell me
I know.
about how your role now is expanded in the new space.
Yeah. So, in addition to being a fractional CMO for Clever Disruption, I'm taking on the role of global marketing strategy practice lead for a global consulting firm that's headquartered out of London called Control versus Exposed.
Mm,
I love the work that the team, we refer to them as CVE, or we refer to us as CVE. I love the work that they've done already. They work with a lot of enterprise brands,
okay.
brands like 7-Eleven, Mars, um, on transformational projects. So it could be a new process transformation. As an example, how do we operationalize marketing
Right.
strategy? They work with them on a lot of data transformation projects. How do we take more ownership over our
Right.
data in order to leverage that data for stronger, more efficient, effective marketing ROI in the ultimate
Right.
outcome? So, my role is to support CVE in standing up their global marketing strategy pillar and complementing the work that they've already
Hmm.
done for years in
Right.
data strategy transformation.
Really exciting work. I'm going to ask this question as you talk about building a practice. What do you look for in your marketing team members? What do you look for in younger team members who are coming in?
I honestly, the number one thing I look for is critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
because what's more valuable to me than you being able to remember how we do the process
Right.
is being able to identify, well, I see a pain point and I have this toolkit of assets that I could leverage to address the pain point, but which tool do I leverage, when, and why? And being able to articulate that with some rationale.
Right.
So for me, it's very important that people who are partnering with me at Clever Disruption or CVE have the ability to critically process and think through the information that they have available to them in order to understand its potential impact.
Right. So when you look and you're building a team, how much is a global understanding important to you as well? You know, CVE is based in
Yeah,
London, you're in Dallas. The brands we're talking about are global by definition.
right.
You know, to talk a bit about that, kind of adding that to our skill set, like a real
Yeah.
true global understanding.
It is important. It is very important. I think it's a privilege that I've had the opportunity
Hmm.
to be exposed to global marketing in the way that I have. Um, we've already talked about the global marketing work I've done with Nestle. I also did global marketing and brand strategy with Sazerac in the spirits industry. Um, my global exposure started actually when I was 14. I was an international exchange student in France. Another
Nice.
example of being quite fearless, I studied
Right.
Spanish and I chose to go to France.
Oh my goodness.
My mother was like, "What are you doing?" I said, I got on the plane. I said, "All I know is bonjour. I'll figure it out." And
Nice.
that's what I did. But that was the first of many experiences I had where I was able to be quiet and just listen and observe. And I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know it then, but I was a researcher.
Hmm.
Even when I was 14, I was doing a sort of ethnographic observational research. And
Right.
so it is important for, I think, all marketers, even if you don't have ambitions of working in a specific global region or country. I think it's valuable to understand cultural nuances and how those nuances present themselves, even in North America, if you're selling paper towels. I mean, we
Right.
live in a country of immigrants to a lot of extents. And so, even if you're selling and marketing in North America, you still need to have an understanding of global culture and global nuances and how that might affect a consumer when they get to the shelf to pick your brand or another.
So speaking of shelves, you started off and spent a ton of time in frozen foods. Do you ever
Yes.
find yourself lost in the aisles today,
Yes.
looking at the
It
brands?
it's it can be overwhelming. It's very exciting to see all the innovation that is taking
Hmm.
place in frozen food, and I do think that there's a health benefit opportunity that frozen food offers. Flash freezing a product at its height of nutrition, it locks it in. And so when you come home, that organic blueberry is just as fresh if you had picked it off of the blueberry bush yourself versus you choosing the frozen option. And so I think there's lots of nutritional benefits to frozen food, but there's a lot of option currently in the frozen food category. And frozen food, breaks down into probably dozens of subcategories, whether it's frozen vegetable, frozen fruit, frozen novelty, frozen ice cream. It goes on and on and on.
Right. So I'm going to keep us in that aisle, and where the aisle itself hasn't changed that much. We talked about the product innovation, but over the last 2 decades that you've worked, what have you noticed about consumer evolution? I think about those choices weren't there 20 years fresh in the market. How, as a researcher, as a listener, as a marketing leader, how have you noticed our consumer habits changing over that time period?
Well, the first observation that came to mind for me was frozen breakfast. That was not so much of a large subcategory 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now it's up to 8 feet in some sections and, 8 out of 24 feet. Frozen burritos, frozen breads, frozen omelet creations, like bite-sized snackable things. Breakfast innovation in particular is one that has expanded quite a lot in the frozen aisle over the last few decades, we'll call it. The other thing that comes to mind for me in terms of innovation in the frozen category is just the merchandising. A lot of the larger mass retailers like Target now, they use more sustainability practices in their frozen merchandising strategy. So instead of having all of the doors lit 24/7, now they're motion activated. So that's an innovation that's connected to the merchandising strategy that I think is a good innovation to have been made. The third thing that comes to mind for me is packaging. Packaging has come so far from the clear or the white bag of product to these full-colored dimensional packages that are in the frozen category. And 20 years ago, brands didn't invest to the level that they do today in packaging and frozen because the thought was, well, it's behind a door. It doesn't matter. Well, we know now that it actually does. It matters significantly, just as much as if the item was in a shelf-stable category.
And you think about it, our packaging experience has emerged as another channel for us. We think about communicating the brand value and meaning. It's very much a part of that. And if you're not stepping up in this space, you best believe your competitive offering to the left and the right are making this an experience of delight. I open up the cold door and Tiffany, there's something magical for me, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, packaging can be a real unlock in terms of distinctiveness, not just in the frozen category, but broadly speaking. And brands that are leveraging packaging to create more ownable brand properties or drive distinctiveness for their brand compared to another are winning.
It really, what I love about our conversation is we're making everybody hungry because we're talking about the delights of frozen food, but really we're having this really sophisticated conversation about marketing strategy. And so how much of the work that you've done did you find immediately transferable as you work with these other brands as a CMO? Like the lessons you've learned, we're talking about the experience and customer listening. Where do you find those moments of true transfer of skills and strategy?
Honestly, it all matters. I still leverage today things that I learned or approaches that I took literally 20 years ago. So it all matters. And it's additive. The more, or cumulative, you could say, the more that you do it, the more it feels like second nature. And there's very little that is truly new to world, in my opinion. I think there's just a subtle twist on how we may have done things in the past and how we can potentially do them today. So everything that I have done, whether it was when I was in undergrad and I interned at Williamsburg in Virginia, giving guided tours and talking about the battlefield. Like, it seems so disjointed. Like, well, how does that connect? Well, I was talking about how people lived and how they built community and how they interacted with community and how they identified themselves, how they positioned themselves, what their needs were, what their wants were. That all relates. It 100% relates to the work I do today, but in a completely different context.
Right. So I'll ask this question because you've spent time as an innovation leader, as a strategy leader, a marketing leader. Where do you find inspiration? Where do you find ways to kind of continue to keep that spark lit?
My instinct was to say everywhere because my head is on a swivel at all times. I'm always, and that's being present. I have to be present where I am at that moment. I find inspiration from other marketers. I find inspiration from being outdoors and just observing nature. I very specifically, I have taken colorway references from watching the leaves change at one point in my life. And that execution was so beautiful because it felt, not to be pun intended, but it felt natural. It felt very reflective of the mood and the emotional state we were trying to communicate. And so something as simple as being outdoors, I take inspiration from. I'm very much an equal part creative and analytical individual. And so I love reading the HBR article or listening to the podcast or having those deep debate conversations. But I equally, I love painting, I draw, I love writing, and that also inspires the work that I do.
That's so great to speak like. So how do you protect that balance or that kind of energy between the spaces of being both HBR analytical and Picasso?
Yeah.
How do you find solutions to do that? I know a lot of people struggle with trying to balance that space for their whole.
Yeah. I don't struggle so much with balancing my analytical and my creative. I think of it more as like I'm accessing my feminine traits, which tend to be creativity and innovation and empathy. And I'm also accessing some of my masculine traits, which tend to be decisive and strategic and very process oriented. And we all have access to both of those energies and both of those traits. It's just we utilize them to different degrees based on maybe our comfort zone. Some of us are less comfortable being creative, and some of us are maybe less comfortable being analytical. But for me, it's not been a struggle because I think of it almost like a dance, it's more of a tango. It's a constant back and forth. It's a weaving in and out. And you couldn't have the same outcome if you only had one of those dancers. You need both of them to create this beautiful outcome.
Wow. I think that's a great way to close our conversation, that we need both sides. We need the science and the art to create this beautiful tango through the frozen food aisles, my friend.
Yes,
we're having fun.
it.
So I'm going to invite you. So we're going to meet somewhere between DC and Dallas, and we're going to spend the afternoon going through and checking out frozen food. I think it will be a delight to see how marketing shows up in the wild. But thank you, Tiffany, so much for this conversation and sharing your journey, but also this space of being a fractional CMO and how leadership shows up and the skills are transferable and transformative. It's been a real delight. Thank you for being a part of this episode. And thank you for leading and living and growing, being fearless. And thank you all for joining us. This has been an incredible episode with Tiffany Wilburn, fearless and brilliant, as you can see, creative marketing strategist, leader, and global CMO. Thank you for joining this episode of AMA's Marketing In.